It's no surprise, but Jets fans have a lot of questions about the team's quarterback position in 2025. Let's answer as many of those questions as we can today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, February 27th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today we have our weekly mailbag show. Usually we do our mailbags on Wednesday, but because we were breaking down what Aaron Glenn and Darren Muji had to say at the NFL Scouting Combine yesterday, we pushed our mailbag to Thursday this week. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Our first question is about Aaron Rodgers. When did the Jets need to make the call on the June 1st designation? Can they leave it until after the first wave of free agency and figure out what their cap looks like? So this question actually pertains to something Darren Muji said on Tuesday when he addressed the media. Jets have two options with Aaron Rodgers when they cut him. They can either make him a regular cut, in which case Rodgers will count $49 million against the salary cap this year, or they can designate him as what's known as a post-June 1st cut. And if the Jets designate Rodgers a post-June 1st cut, it becomes more complex. Rodgers would maintain his current $23.5 million cap hit until June 1st. And on June 1st, that cap hit goes down to $14 million. So the Jets would actually gain $9.5 million in cap space on June 1st. The catch is that Rodgers would then count $34 million against the salary cap in 2026. Whereas the Jets just make Rodgers a regular cut. He counts for $49 million this year, and then the Jets are done in 2026. Darren Muji indicated that the Jets are likely to make Rodgers a post-June 1st cut, which means, again, $23.5 million until June 1st, drops to 14 on June 1st, 34 million in 2026 if the Jets do that. And the question is there a deadline to make the decision? And the answer to that is no. Jets can let this play out as long as they can. Now, if you remember, as long as Rodgers is on the team, he counts $23.5 million. The thing is, until they cut him, he actually occupies a roster spot, which not the biggest deal in the world because in the offseason, you get up to 90 roster spots. And typically, you don't have them all filled until the draft ends. You're not going up to 90 players because you're saving some spots for draft picks. You're also saving some spots for undrafted free agents. So, the Jets could play this out as long as they want to. And the other aspect of this is, when we talk about a player being a post-June 1st cut, in the past, you actually had to wait until after June 1st to cut the player. And teams essentially, thought this through, and they said, well, if we know we're cutting the player, why can't we just declare that he's a post-June 1st cut and then get rid of him? Because it's better for us. We clear up a roster spot. It's also better for the player because the player can go sign with another team. And, I don't know that the Jets would necessarily want to draw this thing out with Rodgers. I think that the way they've handled it, I think so far has been pretty good. I think that the way that they've handled it, they've been professional in it. Rodgers may have not gotten the news that he wanted, and that's what happens. Sometimes you get rid of a player and the player never wants to hear that you're getting rid of him. But you can treat a player with respect. And I think the way you treat a player with respect is you make a decision quickly so that the player has an opportunity to pursue other options. So I don't think the Jets would want to drag this out. But, like I said, in the past, you actually had to wait until June 1st to cut the player. So the Jets could play this out as long as they want. It just Rodgers would continue to occupy a roster spot. I mean, they could actually take it past June 1st. And if they do that, then he doesn't really need to be designated because then it's after June 1st. And so any player cut after June 1st becomes a post-June 1st cut. And then you spread their cap hit out over 2 years. But I mean, I think the Jets should have a better sense. I think the Jets should have a pretty good sense of how they want to handle it now because I think they're kind of mapping out the offseason as we speak. And the thing is, Rodgers keeps that $23.5 million cap hit until June 1st anyway. So cap-wise, if they designate him a post-June 1st cut, they can cut him, but he still counts the same as if he was on the team until June 1st. So there's actually no difference if the Jets do give him that designation. There's no cap difference between now and the 1st of June. I've probably said the phrase June 1st more times than you'd ever like to hear in your life answering that question. Short answer is no, there's no deadline. I mean, they can play this out as long as they want. The short answer is I think that they'll want to move on this quicker, sooner rather than later. I just don't think that they'll want to drag this out because it just creates an unnecessary distraction. And I think they have a sense of like what they want to do in free agency. I don't think there's like some dramatic move that's going to appear on the horizon that would drastically change their options. Next question is from Jimmy. John, most agree there was a big drop-off at quarterback after Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. If you were in Moochie's chair, would one of your main strategies be acquiring 2026 draft capital to assure you get the quarterback next year in what's going to be a loaded quarterback class? Would you be willing to part with Sauce Gardner or Garrett Wilson this year if it guaranteed you the best quarterback in next year's class? Well, as far as the second question goes, you can't guarantee that. So I would not trade Sauce Gardner or Garrett Wilson to guarantee myself the quarterback in next year's class. Now, if you're telling me like you could guarantee me that I'm getting the absolute best quarterback, then yeah, maybe I'd look at it, but you can't guarantee that. If you're asking me, would I trade them to guarantee I can get the first quarterback off the board in next year's class? No, I wouldn't, because I can't guarantee the first quarterback off the board is going to be the best quarterback in next year's class. I think the other issue with this is, especially when we're talking about Garrett Wilson, I think back to what the Carolina Panthers did 2 years ago when they traded up for Bryce Young. And that was a trade that at the time felt very questionable to me for a lot of reasons. But perhaps the biggest reason it felt questionable to me was Carolina, in order to move up for what they hoped would be their franchise quarterback, Carolina traded their number one wide receiver in DJ Moore. And that to me seemed like one of the most self-destructive things you could do, because a young quarterback needs support. And one of the things that any young quarterback can use is a number one receiver. And the Bears gave away the best piece of Bryce Young supporting cast to the Bears to move up for him. It just seems very self-defeating. I think if we get a new young quarterback in here, we want him to have Garrett Wilson as the number one target to throw to. We don't want to give Garrett Wilson away. But I don't think I would be very surprised if there was a scenario that led to the Jets getting a quarterback by trading Garrett Wilson or Sauce Gardner. I think these are the pieces you want to build around. I don't think what's the expression? I don't think you want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that you want to build a quality team. You want to get the quarterback, but you also want quality pieces to be on the team so that the quarterback's not the only guy around. And I don't think you need to trade up for a quarterback. I think that there's this misnomer that, you have to get like a top 2 pick to get a franchise quarterback. And, you look across the league, there are lots of really good quarterbacks who weren't drafted in the top 2. So I don't know that the Jets necessarily need to trade their best players in order to get the quarterback that they want. I think that there are going to be good options in front of this team potentially. And so I would be very, very hesitant to give up one of the top players on the roster in order to hypothetically maybe get a quarterback a year from now, because you also don't know how good the quarterback class is going to be a year from now. Yeah, maybe it looks good on paper now, but things change over the course of a year. In the span of 1 year, things can change wildly. A guy who looks like a great prospect can fall quite a bit. And there could be players who emerge who aren't on your radar right now. I mean, when Joe Burrow was entering his final year at LSU, he started that year, he was viewed as kind of like maybe around the 6th round pick. He ended up winning the Heisman Trophy and being the number 1 overall pick in that draft class. So there's a lot that changes. I would not certainly not trade my best players a year out to hypothetically get a quarterback who may or may not be available. I think there are better ways to get the quarterback. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about one of the ways the Jets might get a quarterback this year, and that's by trying kind of a reclamation project. There's a guy I talked about earlier in the week, Justin Fields. But there are some concerns with this player. How profound should these concerns be? We'll talk about that as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you every day. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Let's continue now with our weekly mailbag. Our next question. John, I agreed with you earlier in the week, at least most of what you said about Justin Fields being a potential bridge quarterback. But are you concerned at all that the Steelers benched him? The Steelers and Tomlin are one of the best organizations in the league, so it makes me think there might not be as much extra in the tank as we might hope. I think you've got a good theory on the increased likelihood of reclamation projects for quarterbacks working out. The specific circumstances, however, for Fields make me a bit nervous. I talked about this earlier in the week, and it seems like there's buzz that's building around Justin Fields potentially being the quarterback for the Jets in 2025. We never know for sure like how these offseason rumors pan out, but when you talk about national reporters, when you talk about local reporters with the Jets, when you talk about local reporters with the Steelers who cover Fields, who probably developed a relationship with him, it seems like there's a lot of buzz building around a potential Jets Justin Fields match. And it's logical. Jets need a quarterback. Fields is looking for a starting job. Fields may not find another team willing to give him a starting role. The Jets may struggle to find a quarterback who's better than Fields. I mean, I think it would be a logical fit at this point in time. And one of the things I mentioned on the show the other day, if you missed it, is that if you look across the NFL, increasingly what you're seeing are guys who were early round picks and failed with their original team going somewhere else and kind of putting it together. We saw that last year with Sam Darnold. We saw it a couple of years ago with Geno Smith, so some former Jets quarterbacks. If you want to go back a few years, you saw it with Ryan Tannehill in Tennessee. To a lesser extent, I think it's true of Baker Mayfield in Tampa Bay, although Baker did have success in Cleveland. He had kind of fallen off. He had a couple rough years. He had a bad final season in Cleveland, then he had a bad year in Carolina, signs with Tampa Bay a couple of years back, and kind of revitalizes his career. And I think like one of the things that's become true in the NFL is teams have become very, very impatient with young quarterbacks. And you understand why. Jobs are on the line, millions of dollars are on the line. But it takes quarterbacks a lot of time to figure a lot of, or at least, not everybody. I mean, you have your CJ Strouds and Joe Burrows of the world who step on the field are great day one, but not every young quarterback's like that. And even quarterbacks who are drafted highly aren't necessarily locks to be great the second they step on the field. There's a development process that needs to happen. And I think teams have become impatient. I think the rookie wage scale has in some ways been a damaging thing to teams and to young quarterbacks because teams get these young quarterbacks on these rookie contracts. They're not paying a lot of the quarterback position. They view it as a great advantage, which it can be. Again, if you have a Joe Burrow on a rookie contract, it's an incredible advantage because you're getting high quality quarterback play at a low price, where a good quarterback these days may cost you $50 million on the open market. You're getting good quarterback play for a fraction of that. And that means you can spend the extra money building up the rest of your team. That's great if you have a quarterback who's capable of setting foot on the field day one and being great, but it's not the case with a lot of guys. A lot of guys need time to develop. They need time to learn how to read defenses. They need time to learn how to beat coverages they haven't seen before. They need time to learn how to run an NFL style offense, setting the protections, making progression reads. These things don't happen overnight, and teams quit on these young quarterbacks. I think in many ways, and this is kind of cynical of these teams, but I think a lot of times GMs and head coaches view these quarterbacks as the guys that will make their life easier. Like, I don't have to do as much if I have a good quarterback, so just go out there, kid, and save my job. It's not really fair to these young quarterbacks. So again, across the league, there are situations where a guy struggles early in his career, but he learns the system. He learns his craft. He learns how to read defenses. He learns these more complex things that you don't really get in college. And maybe 5-6 years into their career, things start clicking for them. It helps when you get into the right offensive system. I think that's what the Jets are trying to put in with Tanner Engstrand. It helps if you have a good supporting cast like a Garrett Wilson at receiver or a solid offensive line blocking. So the question, though, talks specifically about the Pittsburgh Steelers, and it notes accurately the Steelers benched Justin Fields despite having a winning record and despite Fields playing pretty well statistically. And it makes a fair point that the Steelers are a very well-run organization. And if the Steelers benched Fields for Russell Wilson, who obviously was not great, and if the Steelers, aren't willing to keep Justin Fields, should the Jets be interested? And the answer to that is pretty simple. Justin Fields is not the quarterback I would want in an ideal world for the New York Jets. I don't know that he's that good of an option, but we're not dealing with a perfect set of options. We're dealing with a very limited universe of options. And in that limited universe of options, Fields is maybe the best isn't the right word, but maybe the least bad, and maybe the guy with the most upside. Look, I think all the concerns raised about Fields are legitimate, and I certainly am not excited about the idea of Justin Fields playing quarterback. It's just all the other options I think are worse and have less upside. And to be honest with you, I think there's a strong case that includes Aaron Rodgers. We've talked a lot about this, how Aaron Rodgers really wasn't as good as people were making him out to be last year. So when you talk about, first of all, ability, and Fields brings certain skills to the table, including his rushing ability. And if you look at Fields when he's been good, his play has been very, very good. The problem is that hasn't happened consistently enough. But, if you're looking for the upside play, if you're looking for the guy that has the highest odds of success, I think it's Justin Fields. That's not me saying it's great. That's not me saying we lack concerns. The Steelers, with Tomlin deeming him not good enough, yeah, that's a pretty big concern. I think that's a fair thing to say. But I don't know what the better option is available, and that's the challenge. Next question. I'm still perplexed about the John Franklin Myers trade from last year. Has anything ever leaked out about the real reason they traded him? As you've repeatedly pointed out, the salary cap explanation makes no sense. His performance was still good, and although Joe Douglas made bad decisions, you could generally see that there was some logic behind it. In retrospect, it makes me wonder if this was actually the first time that JD had lost control and that Woody was calling the shots. Well, that's an interesting question. Look, I wouldn't put anything past Woody Johnson. I think the John Franklin Myers trade was just one that did not make much sense at the time because, as you mentioned, the Jets the Jets leaked to the media that it was a salary cap based decision, and that was really tough to square with what the Jets were doing because the Jets spent the 2 off seasons not caring at all about the future of their salary cap, but then they drew the line at John Franklin Myers. I thought it was a very frustrating decision on a lot of levels because it was actually one of Joe Douglas's best moves as Jets GM. They got John Franklin Myers off waivers from the Rams at a point where JFM was maybe a rotational guy. He had a sack in the Super Bowl against Tom Brady when he was with the Rams, but he wasn't really that great of a player. And the Jets developed him into a really good contributor, into a plus starter, and they paid him. And it's just so frustrating to me because that's the kind of guy you keep. I'm a big believer that you reward your own guys who succeed for you. And the Jets initially did it. They gave him an extension, but then they just kind of forgot about him. They just decided he wasn't worth having. I mean, could Woody have gotten involved? I mean, again, I wouldn't put anything past Woody, but I think the Jets organization as a whole, the last 2 years, really lost sight of things, and I think they became obsessed with chasing names. I think that they stopped worrying about building a complete team because JFM was a lunch pail player. He didn't post huge stats, but he did a lot of the dirty work. He did a lot of the meat and potato stuff. He was a guy. Winning in the trenches is not always the most, it's not always the flashiest thing, but it's essential. And JFM helped the Jets win in the trenches, and he was productive. But I think the Jets just kind of got starstruck by other guys. I mean, Hassan Reddick would be a good example of that. The Jets saw this guy who was a star, who was flashy, who was available, and they decided they had to have him. And they prioritized him over JFM, who, first of all, was a better fit because JFM is better against the run than Reddick is. And JFM kind of made the defense fit as a big 290-pound guy who could play defensive end in a 4-man front, which there aren't a lot of those guys available. But I think the Jets, the Jets clearly undervalued him because he went to Denver and had a really good season. He actually had a better season than I thought he would in Denver. And I just think the Jets really lost sight of what's important, whether you're talking about rewarding your own players or whether you want to talk about, guys who do the dirty work, who aren't flashy, who aren't stars. They kind of lost track of how important these guys are to build a successful team. And it really was to their own detriment. It's one of the least favorite things the Jets have done in years is let JFM go. They got nothing in return. Now, there have been some rumors that the Jets had a deal worked out with Denver, and it was going to be a pick swap, but then they trade the pick. They were going to swap to move up for Malachi Corley, which, doesn't exactly make the Corley move look a whole lot better. But yeah, look, baffling stuff. Would I be surprised if Woody was involved? No, but I think overall, there's really no good explanation for it. There was no good explanation for it at the time, and there certainly is not now. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, we're not done talking about Woody Johnson. One of my, I love talking about Woody Johnson, and a recent vote from the players rated him as the worst owner in the NFL. We'll talk about that and why it may or may not make Woody change as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Thursday. We're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question: do you think Woody Johnson getting an F will actually change anything about his ownership? So this question is about a report card the NFL Players Association released. And essentially, players give their team a grade on various factors, such as the quality of team facilities, pretty much every aspect of a team. And in this report card, Jets players gave Woody Johnson an F. In fact, Woody Johnson was rated as the worst owner in the league as far as this report card goes. And that's not exactly shocking stuff if you follow the Jets, not just the last year, but the last 15 years, but especially the last year, because the owner has been very erratic. And there have been a few reporters have dug into this, and not surprisingly, the completely just erratic nature of the Jets the last year has really impacted that, particularly firing the head coach 5 games into the season at a point where, to be charitable, it really did not make a lot of sense. And it's really funny because this could be a barometer of the fan base. I actually remember very vividly last year, this report card came off from the NFL Players Association, and the Jets did not really score well in many of the areas. And Jets fans were very dismissive of it because Jets fans, I think, were more hopeful about the future. And there was a lot of talk about, these players are spoiled. Who cares? Look, the people pointed out the Chiefs sometimes score poorly on these report cards. This year, the fan base is a little less happy, and they seem more inclined to believe the report cards that do not score the Jets particularly well. I remember last year, the number one complaint was that the coaching staff was not using its time efficiently. And if you think back, the complaints of the people complaining about the players suggesting that, I think the players were pretty spot on. Will this change the way Woody operates? Look, I'm past the point of trying to sell hope on this ownership group. It's just a dreadful group of owners, and it starts with Woody Johnson. We can talk about his brother. We're at the point where these guys need to prove it. I'm past the point of trying to tell you that things are going to be okay with these guys, because it's been a disaster. And we are now in a 14-year playoff drought. And in those 14 years, I've said this over and over, we've changed players, we've changed coaches, we've changed general managers, we've changed front offices, we've changed uniforms. You name it, we've changed it. The only thing that's been constant is that the Johnson brothers have owned this team. Jets' 14-year playoff drought, number one, that's the longest drought in the NFL. Number two, the second longest drought is half it. The second longest drought is 7 years. Number three, it's not just the longest playoff drought in the NFL, it's the longest playoff drought in any of the 4 major North American sports leagues. And, Woody Johnson is just a dreadful owner. I mean, he's meddlesome. And look, the meddlesome nature did not begin the last year or two. It's gotten worse, though. I think it's worse than it's ever been. I mean, this past year was just ludicrous. When you talk about firing the coach, when you talk about forcing the Devontae Adams trade. And by the way, when he fired the coach, he didn't consult with the GM. And look, I may not have been Joe Douglas's biggest fan near the end of his tenure, but you're firing the coach, you certainly should consult with the GM. Woody Johnson, when the Jets traded for Devontae Adams, you can read the transcripts of what he said. He said, well, he's pretty much said he ordered the trade to be made. And the Jets took on a terrible contract and gave him a third-round pick for essentially three-quarters of a season rental at a point where they were already really out of the playoff race. Just utterly nonsensical stuff. But look, Woody Johnson's been meddlesome in the past. And when he hired John Idzik as his GM, he forced Idzik to keep Rex Ryan. He forced this marriage that really didn't work. 2 guys who did not fit well philosophically. You saw what happened. There were lots of rumors he was behind the team trading Darrelle Revis in 2013. He did not let his football people decide. It's one thing if your football people decide trading Revis is the best move. All indications are Woody Johnson was behind that. I mean, you want to talk about the trade for Brett Favre. I mean, Eric Mangini went on the record. Eric Mangini said, I did not want to trade for Brett Favre, but Woody forced me to do it. And Woody told me, you won't be fired if things don't go well with Favre. What happened? Things didn't go well with Favre, and Mangini got fired. I mean, you can just go down the list. Woody Johnson has been an incredibly meddlesome owner, and it's been incredibly damaging for the New York Jets. And there's really no we need to see him change. And the only thing I can tell you is sometimes owners are really bad and they get so embarrassed that eventually they just figure it out. They just realize what, I can't do this anymore. I can't act like this anymore. For Woody, we're now 25 years into his tenure and he's still acting like this. And maybe I guess the only hope I have is maybe the last couple seasons where he's been so embarrassingly bad and it's been his fault. Maybe that'll embarrass him into letting these guys run the team. And hopefully he hired the right people, because one of the areas where I hear people defend Woody, they'll say, well, he owns the team. If the team's not going well, he has a right to step in. Well, nobody's questioning that he has the right to step in, but when he steps in, he runs things into the ground. And something? the great teams in this league, the owner doesn't step in to destroy the team because you go on a losing streak. The owner doesn't step in and destroy the team because you have one losing season. The idea that the owner can just completely take over the franchise if you have a bad season, that's not sustainable. At some point, you're going to have a rough go of things, and you either have to trust your people or you have to bring in new people, because Woody Johnson's not qualified to make any decisions. And I don't know how many, I'm going to keep saying this because I think it needs to be said, and I don't think it gets said enough in the media in general. Woody Johnson's an abysmal owner, and Woody Johnson deserves no grace. Woody Johnson deserves no benefit of the doubt. Woody Johnson deserves criticism until he proves he doesn't. So you know what? Fine. If Woody goes out there and does and improves the next couple of years, no one will be happier. But you know what? He deserves every bit of criticism he's receiving right now because he has done an abysmal job. That F grade is 100% accurate. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.